Yeah, okay. Um, um, AI Policy Lab is a global public policy think tank dedicated to exploring the role of artificial intelligence and the emerging technologies in addressing global challenges, taking into account the challenges posed by technology. Welcome to our podcast series on AI for SDGs, focusing on SDG 10 today. And thank you for joining us. Today we have with us Morgan Briggs. She's a data scientist, currently serves as the ASIC research assistant within the public policy program in Alan Turing. Morgan has worked on a variety of topics related to social data science, especially ASIC considerations of data science methodologies and digital technologies. Thank you very much to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So firstly, could you take us through what SDG 10 reduce inequality entails and what possible elements of inequalities are we talking about?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a really important conversation that I'm very happy to be a part of. So starting with SDG 10, this deals with reducing inequality within and among countries. So it's important to make that distinction that we're dealing with between countries and also within them. So specifically for SDG 10, we see that there's various targets that we're hoping to meet by 2030, similar to all the other SDGs. So specifically, just to take us through a few of those, we have 7 target indicators, and then we have 3 that are called means of achievement. So how exactly are we going to achieve these targets? So specifically for the outcome base, I'll just focus on a few. We have things such as reducing income inequalities, promoting social, economic, and political inclusion, ending discrimination. Those are kind of in one category. And then we also have more financially based indicators, such as enhancing the representation of less developed countries within financial institutions and adopting fiscal policies that promote equality. And then the last kind of category is also dealing with well-regulated migration policies, which is looped into this SDG. So specifically for the means of achievement, this is how we're going to hopefully achieve these goals by 2030. We have special and differential treatment for less developed countries. So this means that we will be providing investment, or the countries will be providing investment and aid to less developed countries so that they can also reach these goals by 2030. So I think to answer your question, there's a lot of components. There's a lot of different inequalities we see here. There's obviously financial-based and economic-based inequalities, but there's also discrimination in general, which crosses a lot of sectors and a lot of different types of inequality. And so I think just to frame the rest of our conversation, I think it's really important to remember that the SDGs are really intertwined and interrelated, and that SDG 10 is really heavily related to a lot of the other SDGs. So specifically SDG 1 and 2 of ending poverty and zero hunger, and then also SDG 16 of peace, justice, and strong institutions. So I think this is a really important topic to discuss.
Yeah, so in your view, what role would AI play with respect to the achievement of SDG 10? I mean, will AI reduce or exacerbate inequality within and among countries?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think many people would probably say there's 2 sides to the coin of this question. There's potential for both. So I think the first point I would like to make on this is I think we need to ask in specific applications if AI is even necessary, and if a technical solution is necessary, and will it cause more harms than assisting people in any way. So I think the first framing question is, I think, deciding whether or not a technical solution is going to help. So moving forward, I think I'll start with maybe the exacerbating side, and then go end on a positive note of how I think it can reduce inequality if it's done in an ethical way. So starting with exacerbating, I think there are 2 primary considerations that I think come up a lot when we're thinking about whether or not AI models in general will exacerbate or reduce inequality. So the first one has to deal with data representativeness. And that is basically, does our data that we're using to train our AI models, does it fairly represent all communities, and specifically marginalized communities, in that we're talking about inequality? So often these communities are not included in the data set in a representative manner. And this causes more discrimination towards them. When the model is run, it replicates historical patterns of discrimination because AI models are based on pattern recognition from the data that you give it. So a common example of this is facial recognition technologies. We've seen a lot of this in the news lately, unfortunately, for its discrimination, in that the data is often trained on data sets that don't include a representative amount of women and people of color. And we're seeing these models aren't working effectively on those populations. So this is a common example of either missing data or lack of data representativeness. So that's one component I think we need to be really careful about if we're trying to reduce inequality amongst these communities, but they're not represented in our data. That's a huge concern going forward. Another concern I think deals with equal benefits. So the results of the AI model should never discriminate against one group over another, and it should never provide more benefits to one group over another. All things being equal, that is a really important consideration we need to keep in mind. And if these groups are often discriminated against or left out or marginalized, then we need to think about how these AI models could only make that worse if we're not careful. So I think the other thing I wanted to touch on, I think with exacerbating is the conflict with other SDGs. So for example, if we're working towards SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and we're making AI more commonplace and there's more technology and more people are using data analysis software, how would that possibly hinder our progress towards SDG 10 if there's not data infrastructure in certain less developed countries? Will they be able to have those same benefits of the technology? I think is something we need to consider. And so I think those are, I'll kind of put those aside, and then maybe if we come back to them again, just in terms of like ethical AI and deployment. But I think for the reducing inequality, I do think there have been some really interesting, there's been some interesting progress towards achieving SDG 10 with AI. So one of the ways I think AI can be used is to actually monitor the progress towards SDGs by 2030. So monitoring the trends, monitoring all of them kind of in the same database so that we can see our progress towards certain ones over others, I think is a really interesting way to use AI. I think some other things that I've read about involve translating legal frameworks to make those legal frameworks more available. So if the national language is one language, say, many communities may not be able to access them because they're not in the language that they speak. So I think this is a really important thing for accessibility, which obviously, as we know, is tied a lot with inequality or equality. And I think also the spotting of inequalities in legal practices, I think, is another way that it has been used. And I think that's an interesting way moving forward to think about how we can use it to spot discriminatory practices in frameworks and such. And I think other positives, I'm not sure that SDG 10 is the best suited SDG for AI. I do think that there are other SDGs that perhaps have more straightforward use cases that may not have as many potentially negative impacts on equality and such. And so I think things like focusing on the SDGs related to the environment, so identifying air pollutants, or for poverty and hunger, thinking of the models that model locust plagues and those types of things. I think we've seen great progress with those. So I think by focusing on SDGs, we also could be progressing towards reducing inequality as well if we do it in the right way.
Yeah. As you said, the AI to SDG 10 has two sides to the con. So I think we have to pay more attention to the disadvantages. So what's possible so what's the best way, to implement AI in least developed countries to ensure that they are not left behind the AI translation? I mean, some countries maybe now do not have some enough the network or some cooperation like this. So yeah, what's your opinion?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it touches on a lot of the concepts related to the digital divide, which we're seeing as a problem both within and among countries, especially when we're considering SDG 10 and inequality. So I think one of the first points I would raise here again, and I think I mentioned this before, was I think we need to just guard against techno-solutionism and this idea that technical problems can fix things such as inequality. There's nothing saying that we can't do these practices ethically and contribute towards reducing inequality, but I think we need to be really careful because a lot of these inequalities that we see are embedded in historical institutions, and they're going to definitely require collaboration amongst groups and involve a lot of human involvement. I think we need to really remember that. So I think some recommendations I have, and I think before prefacing was saying that human involvement, domain expertise are two really important things that I think need to be a huge contribution towards the development of AI models. And I've heard a lot of people speak about this becoming hopefully more of a trend with the SDGs, is the idea of participatory design and collaborating when building these technologies, especially with those that the context is close to them and it's not remote to them. They understand the variables that should be measured and what's important to their community. I think we really need to continue progressing towards that. I think it's a really exciting space. So some recommendations so that we make sure that less developed countries are also progressing at the same rate towards these SDG goals. I think speaking of the digital divide, I think we really need to consider digital infrastructure. So this includes computing power, but also digital expertise and digital literacy. So training teams within these countries to have the infrastructure and the skills available to them to make models that are within their countries and local to their needs. And this has to do with domain expertise too, is making sure that these models are applicable to their context. And often, when they're built remote to those contexts outside of those countries, we often miss the main indicators that they would have liked to have in their models. And often they end up not being used in the most efficient way because they weren't developed with the people who would be using the model. I think some other things would be data autonomy. So unfortunately, with the age of data and such, there's data being collected all the time. And when we provide digital infrastructure to these countries, often what happens is their data is then harvested for profitable means and without their consent. And so this is kind of a twofold issue, is we need to focus on data privacy regulation, which is still lacking in a lot of less developed countries or not fully established yet, which prevents them from having the control over their citizens' data, and also the citizens obviously having control over their own personal data. I think those are two really important things that we need to work on. And I think maybe the last point I would say is along these lines of economic impact. There was a survey, I think, a study by PwC that stated by 2030, 70% of the global economic impact from AI will accrue in China and North America. So I think we really need to think about, if deploying these technologies, if they're being deployed for economic benefit, are they actually helping these countries progress economically? And in doing so, are they actually exacerbating inequality by only providing access to these technologies to wealthier individuals versus the communities that are often marginalized? So there's a lot of considerations here for sure, but I think collaboration along these lines, I think we can really come up with something that protects these communities and also allows them to use these technologies in a beneficial way.
So finally, what's possible measures or recommendations do you propose to enable efficient use of AI and emerging technologies in achieving SDG 10?
So I think there are a lot of measures and recommendations across a lot of fields, because I think the thing that we really need to focus on is this idea of interdisciplinary collaboration on achieving this. I think we need to obviously include technologists and data scientists, because often they're the ones building the models, but I think we need to really include the social sciences and other disciplines to make sure that we're thinking of all the different factors, legal factors, economic factors, and obviously human factors that I think are definitely the most important when it comes to human dignity. So I think this list could be very long, but I think the three, maybe I'll do three just for the sake of time, but I think bolstering digital infrastructure, as I said, and increasing digital literacy and data science expertise, I think are three really important things that will help us progress towards SDG 10 by 2030. The second one I think that's really critical is incorporating AI ethics into our progress towards the SDGs. I've heard a few people speak about this. I've been fortunate to listen in to some conversations, and it does seem like perhaps those fields are quite disparate, and maybe we can find a way to blend them more. And because I think at the basis, we're all wanting the same thing. Hopefully, that those developing AI, we're all trying to provide some benefit and reduce inequality. That's our goal. And I think the only way we can do that effectively is the points I mentioned before, but also making sure that when we get to that stage and we have the digital infrastructure and the we're about to make a model, we're considering making the model, we need to make sure that a host of ethical considerations are included before we go about deploying it to ensure that we don't end up harming any community at all. So that's something that I really think I'm excited to see the work there, because I think we're starting to move in that direction, and I think it would be really cool to see the integration. And then the last one I would say is less technical related, but it's focusing on institutional inequality. So we need to really go from the ground up and focus on where these inequalities are coming from in the first place. They're a lot of the times embedded in historical practices, legal practices. And I think the only way in which we can overcome that is through human involvement and awareness, and trying to go about that in a collaborative interdisciplinary way, such as by focusing on SDGs like eradicating hunger, and also promoting education, social protections, and eliminating discriminatory laws and practices, I think are three ways that we can try to overcome these inequalities. And I think, ending on a hopeful note, I really do think that there is a lot of potential for AI, and I think building in ethical practices and going about it in a really interdisciplinary collaborative way will allow us to build these models that include all communities and don't leave any vulnerable community out of our models, but also provide benefits to them and don't exacerbate inequality in any way. I think there's a lot of potential, but I think we just need to be, as you said earlier, just a bit guarded about the potential disadvantages, because they could in fact be devastating to these groups that are already marginalized.
Okay, thank you very much. Your views will contribute greatly to our final report on AI and SDG 10. Yeah, and our video will be uploaded to the website. If you want to view the Connect before the uploading, please contact me. Okay, thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, thanks.